Now, with your newer work, The Game of You, that you're currently going around talking about and signing, now this story is different in a way because here you go into dreams and also into a lot of things that are in themselves controversial subjects. You have lesbians wandering through here and transsexuals and all sorts of things that in themselves probably drew a lot of controversy in the way you portray them. But at the same time, this one, if anything, is more of a reversal of things like, oh, Amethyst Princess of Gemworld or something like that.
Sure, I have to admit, and this may be terribly naive of me, that it's only in the last month or so since that actually came out as a book, people have been turning around to me and saying, did you intend to be so controversial? And I say, no, is it controversial? And they say, oh yes. And, which I find very odd. I can't imagine that had I done those characters outside of a comic, people would have particularly thought it was controversial. I don't know.
I think Wanda still would have turned up as controversial in most areas, especially with the family's treatment of her, or him, depending on how you look at it.
What was odd about the death of Wanda, the transsexual character, is that I made all that up. I just sort of figured, what would a fairly small-minded family do if their son, who'd become a daughter, died? And I got letters afterwards from people saying, how did you know? And that had happened to friends of theirs, which I found very strange and scary, because I made it up. Yes, you're right. The kind of areas that are occupied in Season of Mists by the Norse gods, by angels, by order and chaos, by the Egyptian gods, by the fairies, in A Game of You are occupied by lingering remnants of the Oz books, little bits of Narnia, old fossils of Middle-earth. It's about dreams. It's about childhood dreams. It's about what happens to the dreams of childhood when you grow up and forget about them. It's about fantasy worlds and why we need them, and whether they're a good thing or a bad thing. And it's not a terribly upbeat story. I'm not sure it's depressing either, but it's definitely walks a very strange little knife edge, that book.
Well, it's not a happy story, and the fact that a lot of characters die, at least temporarily or permanently, depending on which ones, makes it a very unsettling story, I think.
One of the things that fascinated me was which I think works very well now that it's collected, or it seems to work now that it's collected, and confused people mightily when it came out as a monthly comic, is the fact that it moves in a series of lurches from genre to genre. The first chapter is almost mainstream, and then it rapidly becomes horror, then it becomes fantasy, then it becomes horror, then it becomes almost sort of Tolkien-esque fantasy for a chapter, and it keeps moving. And also, of course, it takes place over a very short period of time. Most of the action in the book takes place over a sort of 18-hour period, which again, I think people found a little confusing when it came out over a period of 9 months.
Well, when you were writing it, were you planning it to have that disjointed feel to it?
Yes, I was. I wanted something that was going to play with and upset people's genre expectations. Genres create expectations. These days, the way that people are trained and conditioned, you know within 5 minutes of seeing a movie, pretty much by the end of the titles and a couple of minutes in, what kind of movie it is. You know if it's a horror movie or a romance, you know if it's a horror movie, what kind of horror movie it's going to be. If it's a slasher movie, you know that people are going to keep getting it until the end, when finally the one remaining heroine probably is going to impale the slasher on his own thing, but then the body will vanish. And there are rules to genre fiction, and I wanted to see if I could play with them, see if I could tangle with them. I suppose the moral of Game of You, if there is one, is just that people are hugely more complicated and hugely more interesting than they appear on the outside. And Game of You is a story about the insides of people.
Well, I think by your switching genres back and forth, one of the things you did was sort of keep people on their toes, because since the genre kept switching, they didn't know which one was going to include the ending.
Exactly. The ending is not predictable from the work. You don't know what's going to happen. And I think I was very pleased with the ending, I think, when I got to it. I have to say, while I was writing it, and pretty much until I got there, I didn't know who was going to survive the storyline. That was as much of interest and news to me as it was probably to any of the readers, although I knew a few months earlier than they did.
Now, one thing I've noticed when I'm reading your work is that it does require a little bit more attention and effort than just a casual comic book. For instance, when you were doing Miracle Man, what I found was that I tended to accumulate several issues and want to read them together rather than reading them month to month. And I think your work on The Sandman reads very much the same way, where it does read as cohesive story arcs designed to be novels rather than short pieces.
What I've been trying to do, especially with Sandman, is alternate longish story arcs that take me about 7 to 10 months with sequences of short stories where you can just pick it up and read it and get mostly everything there is to be gotten out of it in one sitting. An opinion seems fairly clearly divided amongst readers about which is their favorite way of doing it. I get letters from people who say, I really like the short stories, hate the long story arcs, and letters from readers telling me how much they love the story arcs and they wish I'd stop doing the short stories. For me, it's a matter of self-defense. When I work on a long story, I find myself with lots and lots of ideas that simply don't fit in, and getting really rather fidgety about the constraints of working on the same story for 11 months. So then I go off and do short stories. And by about month 3, I'm suddenly filled with nostalgia with those days when I didn't have to invent absolutely everything from page 1. But when I sat down to write something, I knew where we were, I knew who all the characters were, and I had a shape to the story. So I tend to sort of bob backwards and forwards between them.
So each one gives you a rest from the other style of writing.
Exactly. Each one is a refuge.
You're listening to Hour 25. I'm your host, Nick Smith, and we're here tonight with Neil Gaiman talking about his writing on The Sandman and other projects. Now, when you got together with Terry Pratchett to write Good Omens, what exactly were you starting out to do?
What we were actually starting out to do was have some fun. I wrote the first 5,000 words of Good Omens back in about 1988, and sent them to Terry because I thought he'd like to see them. And he, about a year later, and then I put them in a drawer and went off and did other projects. And about a year later, he phoned me up and said, "Do you remember that thing you started?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Are you ever going to do anything with that?" And I said, "Well, yeah, probably not." And he said, "Oh, well, I'll tell you what, either you can sell me the idea or we can work on it together." And I said, "Well, great, let's work on it together." So I sent him the first 5,000 words. He retyped them because we couldn't find the disc. And by the time he'd finished typing them, they became the first... Actually, they became a 10,000 words, about 4,000 or 5,000 words into the book. And then we just went for it. We used computer discs traveling backwards and forwards. I'd write very, very late at night when I'd finished everything else. So about 3 o'clock in the morning, wherever I was up to, I'd stop and whatever I was doing and start writing some Good Omens. And I'd wake up and there'd be messages on my answer phone from Terry Pratchett saying, Wake up, you have to wake up, you bastard. I've written a really funny bit. Ring me back. And we'd have long phone calls, and it was a great deal of fun. And neither of us knew that it was going to be saleable, even. I remember a conversation we had about 3/4 of the way through the book, where we were just talking about whether or not, if no publishers ever wanted to do it, whether we could just write it off and forget about it. And we decided, yes, we could. It had only been, 3 months' work while we were doing other things. And then, all of a sudden, auctions and things started happening, and it became very serious. But, no, we basically did it for fun.
Now, your background is as a newspaper journalist, I believe?
I was more of a magazine journalist than a newspaper journalist. I wasn't a very good newspaper journalist. I didn't have whatever sort of killer instinct it takes. I quite like American journalism, I quite like. Especially the Weekly World News. I think that's brilliant. You get to make up the stories in the office, and then you print them. I think that's wonderful.
Well, it solves the problem of research.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's great. If we'd have been allowed to do that, I would have been quite happy. But no, I gave up. I gave up journalism. The newspaper I was working for was plunging more and more down market and tabloid. And I got a phone call from them one day saying, Neil, you're our science fiction and fantasy person, and you must know something about Dungeons and Dragons. And I said, well, yeah, I've got some friends who play it. They said, great, we want an article on how it drives people to madness, insanity, or Satan worship, or suicide. When can you get it to us by? And I said, well, I'm not going to do it. And they said, why not? And I said, because I'm not working for you anymore. And that was basically my exit from journalism. And
an interesting exit.
But I didn't have the heart for it.
Sure.